to better explain how a nation's borrowing can impact its health. Let's look at a teaching model I've developed for government spending. So we're going to let G equal government spending. And what you have across a long period of time is the primary way governments are getting their money to spend is through T, and we're going to let T equal to tax revenue. Now I put this as with 3 bars because it's kind of a rule, and it's not in the current period, it's across time. So I'll put a small t here to kind of denote that across time we're going to be able to see that the tax revenue among many different instances over many different periods of time, many different countries, should be roughly equal to the government spending. The government has to take the money from somewhere, and from the way we're looking at it, the government is taking from the economy, and we're measuring what they take from the economy to spend by using tax as a measure for that. Now, in the short run, we're going to remove one of those bars, so I'm just going to have G equals T. So in the very long run, you're going to see it about equal. But in the short run, you might also see them equal, but that's not often the case. Sometimes, very rarely, you actually see that tax revenue exceeds government spending. That happens once in a while. It is rare. Last time it happened in the United States was late 90s, early 2000s. But more often what you see is government spending exceeds tax revenue, which creates a problem for operations. So if you have a certain amount of money you want to spend, and it is not equal to tax revenue because you're spending more than what you would like, you have a couple of options. The first is you could go ahead and cut government spending. You could also raise tax revenue, or a combination of the both. The problem with this is if you lower government spending, it's politically difficult and people get upset because they don't get the money from the programs, or some service the government is offered is no longer offered, and it upsets people. If you raise taxes, obviously people don't like to pay taxes, so if you do that, it also causes political and other kinds of pain. A combination, of course, also painful. You're just taking it here, taking it there. People don't like it. So often to fix this problem, what governments do is they choose to set these equal, and they have to make up for it somehow, and that would be by borrowing. They will issue bonds. We're going to call that D for debt. They're issuing new debt in order to finance their deficit. The deficit is the difference between what they are spending and what they're bringing in tax revenue. Okay, and this model shows you that in the short run, you can prop up your spending by borrowing money. That doesn't work as well in the long run, with the exception as if your economy is growing faster than your debt accumulation. You can continue this for a very, very long time. This model also looks like any government entity that has no currency printing. So for example, the state of Texas cannot print its own money, so they can borrow money with special bonds and stuff. A lot of state constitutions prohibit borrowing, but with special bonds that are approved by either the legislature or voters, they often can. This also looks like a school district. They can borrow with voter approval, but they can't necessarily do anything else. This also looks like countries that do not print their own currency, such as Greece, because Greece is part of the euro currency. This is also France. France is part of the euro currency. However, if you are a country that prints its own money, you also have another tool in your bag of tricks in order to make this work. You also have what we're going to call M. Now, M in other kinds of economics means money. In this case, we're going to call it is money. It is the printing of money, but it's technically what we're going to call monetization. Monetization of the debt. Basically what happens in a technical sense, I mean, you could technically, the central bank could print the money and then the government could spend it. That is quite possible. It does happen sometimes. But in the US, when we do this, it looks a little different. We're going to split the government here into 2 components to figure out how the technical monetization works. So you have the Fed, which is the United States' central bank. You have the Treasury, which issues bonds and also spends the money. So when you're actually monetizing, what you're doing is you're issuing bonds. So the Treasury is issuing a new bond, Right here is a B for a bond, or I'll put D for debt instrument because that's what we have it up there. So they're issuing new debt, and the Fed prints new money, and what happens is the Fed buys the debt and holds the debt, and the Treasury gets the money, and then the Treasury spends the money out to whatever they would like to do. Now, it's really, I was telling this to a former student, and they were like, so basically it's like one hand doing one thing to give the other hand stuff, and that's essentially it. Both of these are functions of government. In the United States and many other highly performing countries, there's a strict political division between the two of them to try to keep malevolence away, but essentially what you're doing is printing money and spending it using the guise of borrowing it from the central bank is how monetization works. Now, monetization can have both positive and negative effects on the economy depending on a lot of different factors. If the economy is in trouble, if there's a slowness in the economy, a crisis going on, printing money can actually be a positive thing because it helps shore up the economy. It holds a position that maybe private businesses are not spending, and so the government comes in and is spending, and they're using printed money in order to do that. We're going to call that accommodation. Okay, accommodation means they are accommodating a problem in the economy. Either there's not enough money floating around in the economy, there's a crisis that money being injected into the economy would help, something like that. Monetization with an accommodative purpose is quite okay. That's not going to cause any kinds of problems. However, if you come over here, there's another kind of monetization, and it's essentially the same thing, but it has very different results. And I just put a Z there to mean monetization without any accommodation there. So I used a Z. So you have monetization here that is essentially looking at printing just because we need to print money to spend. We can't get it from anywhere else. That's essentially what that means. And this one, either immediately in some cases, or if it's a surprise, or if it's new, often with a delayed effect, this one here, MZ, is going to lead to inflation. So here's kind of how this model works. You can plug in numbers and work with it, but you have this essential problem. You have too much government spending for your tax revenue, so you begin to borrow. You borrow and borrow and borrow, and you cannot close that. Nobody wants to raise taxes. Nobody wants to cut spending. Or a lot of times when a crisis happens, there's some big event, some national crisis, some war, something like that. You borrow, and at some point, people are like, I'm not going to lend you any more money. The market says no more. Interest rates on your debt, issuance might go up, but at some point it will be very difficult to borrow, or the market just will refuse to buy any more debt. So all of a sudden, that is no more. That has to be zero at some point. Then, if you still can't close your deficit here, since you no longer can borrow, you start printing money. And if you're printing money here, again, this is not so bad. If you had a crisis going on, printing is not necessarily a negative thing. Again, not necessarily resulting in outsized inflation, anything like that. That's okay. But at some point, you get over here and you move from accommodative money over to the monetization money, which leads to inflation and can have a problem. So here's the problem we don't know. This plus sign here is very fuzzy. We don't know where the line between accommodative printing and just printing in order to print. We don't know where that line is, and we don't know sometimes even immediately after we've crossed the line. And once we know we've crossed it, with inflation being excessively high, we don't know what amount it was. So we don't exactly know the boundary of the different kinds of monetization, and it's hard to tell. It's hard to ferret out kind of how that works. So you have this model which kind of, for currency issuing nations, if they're having a crisis, they're normally having a debt crisis at the same time they're having a currency crisis, meaning too much inflation, because when you're in a crisis, debt and printing are a substitute for each other as a way to plug deficits and keep the government operating. In some cases, inflationary problems can happen because of a crisis or what you might consider to be a good reason. Other times, because the government is not politically able or maybe even self-disciplined enough to do the hard choices, the raising of taxes, the lowering of government spending, in order to fix it otherwise.